Good day and most welcome to 1307. I will continue with the wondrous book by Nisbett, Geography of Thought. And I am currently into hokum, emotion and math. Wondrous title. And I had just mentioned the Barnum effect and how it could be different between Koreans and Americans when it comes to that aspect. Americans who said they were more polite said they were less rude. Or if they said they were less polite, tended to say they were more rude. A red flag apparently went up for Americans, indicating possible contradiction, but what was less likely to do so for Koreans. In an even more striking demonstration of inconsistency, Choi gave Korean and American participants a large number of statements that were literal or near literal opposites of each other. A person's character is his destiny, or a person's character is not his destiny. The more one knows, the more one believes, or the more one knows, the less one believes. Choi gave some participants one of the opposed pair of propositions, and some participants the other. If the Americans, given the first statement of the pair, tended to agree with it, the Americans, given the other statement, tended to disagree with it. But this was not necessarily true for Koreans, who were likely to agree with whichever statement of the pair they saw. There is a poem by William Butler Yeats called Lapis Lazuli. It describes a gemstone with a carving showing a pair of elderly Chinese men under a pagoda roof on a mountainside. There, on the mountain and the sky, on all the tragic scene, they stare. One asks for mournful melodies. Accomplished fingers begin to play. Their eyes, mid many wrinkles, their eyes, their ancient glittering eyes are gay. It may be that Yeats was right to make his point with people who were Chinese, because there is evidence that the simultaneous experience of conflicting emotions is more common for Easterners than for Westerners. Kai Ping-peng and his colleagues asked Japanese and American participants to look at faces and to indicate what kinds of emotions they expressed. For Americans, faces were happy or sad, angry or frightened. The more they reported seeing positive emotions, the less they reported seeing negative emotions. Common sense and lots of data collected over the years by psychologists suggests things could scarcely be otherwise. But indeed, they were otherwise for the Japanese participants. They were quite likely to report seeing both positive and negative emotions in the same face. East Asians also seem to have no trouble accepting apparent contradictions in their own emotions. Organizational psychologists Richard Nisbett, Nancy Wong, and Yaojia Yi asked Chinese, Korean, and American participants to rate their emotional states at the moment and their emotional states in general. American participants tended to report experiencing uniformly positive emotions or uniformly negative ones. But for Chinese and Korean respondents, there were little relationship between the intensity of positive emotions they reported. Reporting strong positive emotions was fully compatible with expressing strong negative emotions. Confucius was apparently speaking for at least a very large fraction of the world's people when he said, "I am sometimes accused of contradiction myself. Why do non-logical Asians tend to do so much better in math and science than Americans? How can this be if East Asians have trouble with logic?" There are several answers to this question. First, it should be noted that we don't actually find East Asians to have trouble with formal logic. We just find them to be less likely to use it in everyday situations where experience or desire conflicts with it. Second, Eastern lack of concern about contradiction and emphasis on the middle way undoubtedly does result in logical errors. But Western contradiction phobia can also produce logical errors. The Eastern reputation for math skills is really quite recent. Traditional Chinese and Japanese culture emphasized literature, the arts, and music as the proper pursuits of the educated person. In research with young and elderly Chinese and American, we and others find that only the young Chinese outperform their American counterparts. Comparably schooled older and Chinese and Americans perform similarly in math. Asian math education is better, and Asian students work harder. Teacher training in the East continue throughout the teacher's career. Teachers have to spend much less time teaching than their American counterparts. And the techniques in common use are superior to those found in America. Both in America and in Asia, children of East Asian background work much harder on math and science than European Americans. The difference in how hard children work at math is likely due, at least in part, to the greater Western tendency to believe that behavior is the result of fixed traits. Americans are inclined to believe that skills are qualities you do or don't have. So there is not much point in trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. Asians tend to believe that everyone, under the right circumstances and with enough hard work, can learn to do math. In short, Asian superiority in math and science is paradoxical, but scarcely contradictory. I have presented a large amount of evidence to the effect that Easterners and Westerners differ in fundamental assumptions about the nature of the world, in the focus of attention, in the skills necessary to perceive relationships, and to discern objects in complex environment, in the character of causal attribution, in the tendency to organize the world categorically or relationally, and in the inclination to use rules, including the rules of formal logic. Two major questions arise in the light of these contentions. Does it matter? Is it going to continue? Chapter 8 addresses the former question, and the epilogue addresses the latter. Chapter 8. And if the nature of thought is not everywhere the same. Differences between Easterners and Westerners have been found in virtually every study we have undertaken, and they are usually large. Most of the time, in fact, Easterners and Westerners were found to behave in ways that were qualitatively distinct. Americans on average found it harder to detect changes in the background of scenes, and Japanese found it harder to detect changes in objects in the foreground. Americans in general fail to recognize the role of situational constraints on a speaker's behavior, whereas Koreans were able to. The majority of Koreans judged an object to be more similar to a group with which it shared a close family resemblance, whereas an even greater majority of Americans judged the object to be more similar to a group to which it could be assigned by a deterministic rule. When confronted with the two apparently contradictory propositions, Americans tended to polarize their beliefs, whereas Chinese moved toward equal acceptance of the two propositions. When shown a thing, Japanese are twice as likely to regard it as a substance than as an object. And Americans are twice as likely to regard it as an object than a substance, and so on. Yep. So we continue. When confronted with two apparently contradictory propositions, Americans tended to polarize their beliefs, whereas Chinese moved toward equal acceptance of the two propositions. When shown a thing, Japanese are twice as likely to regard it as a substance than an object. And Americans are twice as likely to regard it as an object than as a substance. And so on. The lesson of the qualitative differences for psychologists is that had the experiments in question been done just with Westerners, they would have come up with conclusions about perceptual and cognitive processes that are not by any means general. And in fact, just such mistaken conclusions about universality have been mistakenly reached for many of the processes reported in this book. It seems clear that we need a reconsideration of which perceptual and reasoning processes are basic and which are subject to substantial variation from one human group to another. The fault lines are going to lie deeper and in different locations than has been suspected up till now. Does it matter? But the results reported in the body of the book are based mostly on laboratory tests. Why should we assume the findings are anything more than hothouse plants that have no counterpart in real world thought or behavior? The question is a fair one, and it will be instructive to attempt to answer it. There are, in fact, many domains of life in which Easterners and Westerners think and behave quite differently. And these differences are well understood. In terms of our claims about holistic versus analytic thought. Medicine. Medicine in the West retains the analytic, object-oriented, and interventionist approaches that were common thousands of years ago. Find the offending part or humor and remove it or alter it. Medicine in the East is far more holistic and has never until modern times been in the least inclined toward surgery or other heroic interventions. Health is the result of a balance of favorable forces in the body. Illness is due to a complex interaction of forces that must be met by equally complex, usually natural, mostly herbalist remedies and preventives. dissection of bodies into their component parts was practiced by ancient Greeks, and with a hiatus during the Middle Ages, has been practiced in the West for at least 500 years as well. Dissection was not introduced from the West, of course, to Eastern medicine until the 19th century. Law contemplate the following equation. First, we define a society's preference for lawyers over engineers as a ratio. Number of lawyers in the society, number of engineers in the society. Next, we define a ratio of such ratios as two countries' relative preference for lawyers over engineers. Number of lawyers, engineers in society, A. Number of lawyers, engineers in society, B. The number we get when we divide the lawyer preference ratio of the United States by the lawyer preference ratio of Japan is 41. Beyond belief. Those lawyers in the US are put to good use. Conflict between individuals in Western countries is handled to a substantial degree by legal confrontations, whereas it is much more likely to be handled in the East by intermediaries. In the West, the goal is satisfaction of a principle of justice. And the presumption going into the arena of conflict resolution is typically that there is a right and a wrong, and there will be a winner and a loser. The goal in Eastern conflict resolution is more likely to be hostility reduction, and compromise is assumed to be the likely result. Westerners call on universal principles of justice to push their goals. And judges and juries feel obligated to make decisions that they believe would hold for everyone in approximately similar circumstances. In contrast, in the East, flexibility and broader attention to particular circumstances of the case are the earmarks of wise conflict resolution. As a citizen of pre-revolutionary China put it, a Chinese judge cannot think of law as an abstract entity, but as a flexible quantity, as it should be personally applied to Colonel Huang or Major Li. Accordingly, any law which is not personal enough to respond to the personality of Colonel Huang or Major Li is inhumane, and therefore no law at all. Chinese justice is an art, not a science. Debate decision processes in Japanese boardrooms and executive councils are designed to avoid conflict and dissonance. Meetings are often little more than a ratification of consensus achieved by leaders beforehand. Japanese managers tend to deal with conflict with other managers by simple avoidance of the situation, whereas Americans are far more likely than Japanese to attempt persuasions. What is intrusive and dangerous in the East is considered getting means for getting at the truth in the West. Westerners place an almost religious faith in the free marketplace of ideas. Bad ideas are no threat, at least over the long run, because they will be seen for what they are. If they can be discussed in public. There has never been such an assumption in the East, and there is not today. Science. In the decade of the 90s, scientists living in the United States produced 44 Nobel Prizes. And the Japanese produced just one. Despite the fact that Japanese funding for science is fully half that of the US. West Germany, which spends half as much on science as Japan, has produced 5 Nobel Prize winners. And France, with far less funding even than Germany, has produced 3. The relatively slight accomplishments of Japanese science can be chalked up partially to the Confucian respect for elders. That funnels support to mediocre older scientists. Instead of more talented younger ones. But some Japanese scientists attribute the deficit in part to the absence of debate and intellectual confrontation. Peer review and criticism are rare in Japan, where such things are considered rude and where there is not widespread acceptance of their role in clarifying and advancing thought about scientific matters. As one Japanese scientist put it, I worked at the Carnegie Institution in Washington, and I know 2 eminent scientists who were good friends. But once it came to their work, they would have severe debates. even in the journals. That kind of things happens in the United States, but in Japan, never. Rhetoric. The resistance to debate is not merely a social or ideological one, nor is it limited to purely quantitative outcomes, such as the number of scientific papers produced. The reluctance extends to the very nature of communication and rhetoric. Western rhetoric, which provides the underlying structure for everything, from scientific reports to policy position papers, usually has some variation of the following form. Background, problem, hypothesis or proposed proposition, means of testing, evidence, arguments as to what the evidence means, refutation of possible counter-arguments, and conclusion and recommendations. Most Westerners I speak to about this format take it for granted, that it is universal. How else could one communicate findings and recommendations briskly and convincingly, or even think clearly about what one is doing? The truth is, however, that this linear rhetoric form is not at all common in the East. For my own Asian students, I find that the linear rhetoric forms is the last crucial thing they learn on their road to becoming fully functioning social scientists. Contracts. To the Western mind, once a bargain is struck, it shouldn't be modified. A deal is a deal. For Easterners, agreements are often regarded as tentatively agreed upon guides for the future. These opposing views have often caused conflict between Easterners and Westerners. Recall the bitterness between Japanese and Australian business people over Australia's refusal to renegotiate a contract for sugar when the price dropped radically on the world market. The Japanese were not being hypocritical or purely self-serving. Japanese suppliers take such matters under consideration with their own customers. If it snows in Tokyo, film distributors are likely to compensate. Theater owners for their diminished audiences. As business professors Hamden Turner and Entrepreneurs note, looked at analytically on an item by item basis is not cost effective, but looked as a strengthening the relationship between customer and supplier, it makes very good sense. In short, the Japanese take a holistic view of the business relationship, including its context over time. Kalle, could you put a pause there? Sorry for the disruption. I will continue. Oh. International relations. An international conflict influenced by differing conceptions of causality occurred between China and the United States when a Chinese fighter plane collided with an American surveillance plane, and the surveillance plane was forced to land on a Chinese island without receiving permission from the ground. The Chinese held captive the crew of the surveillance plane, demanding an apology for the incident from the US. The Americans asserting that the cause of the accident was the recklessness of the fighter pilot refused. political scientist Peter Hayes Grice and social psychologist Kai-Ping Peng have observed that to the Chinese an insistence that there was such a thing as the cause of the accident was hopelessly limited in its perspective. Relevant to the accident were a host of considerations, including the fact that the US was, after all, spying on China. There was a history of interaction between the particular surveillance plane and the particular fighter, and so on. Given the complexity and ambiguity of causality taken for granted by the Chinese to be the case in this instance, as in all others. The very least the United States could do would be to express its regrets that the incident occurred. The presumed ambiguity of causality may lie behind Eastern insistence on apology for any action that results in harm to someone else. No matter how unintentionally and indirectly ultimately, the regret formula was the one that China and US hit upon to resolve the impasse. But it is not likely that many people on either side understood the role played in the conflict by the differing conceptions of causality that Grice and Peng identified. Human rights. Westerners seem inclined to believe there is only one kind of relation between the individual and the state that is appropriate. Individuals are separate units and they enter into a social contract with one another and with the state that entails certain rights, freedoms and obligations. But most peoples, including East Asians, view societies not as aggregates of individuals, but as molecules or organisms. As a consequence, there is little or no conception of rights that inhere the individual. For the Chinese, any conception of rights is based on a part, whole. As opposed to one many conception of society. To the extent that the individual has rights, they constitute the individual's share of the total rights. When Westerners see East Asians treating people as if they have no rights as individuals, they tend to be able to view this only in moral terms. Whatever the moral appropriateness of the behavior of East Asian officials, and I share with most Westerners the view that there is such a thing as individual human rights, and that they sometimes are violated in East Asia. It is important to understand that to behave differently would require not just a different moral code, but a different conception of the nature of the individual. A different conception of the individual would in turn rest on an inclination to think about the world in terms of individual units rather than continuous substances at the most basic metaphysical level. It is also important to recognize that East Asians and other interdependent peoples have their own moral objections to Western behavior. When East Asian students become comfortable enough to speak out in Western classrooms, they will often express bewilderment at how much disorder, crime, and exposure to violent and sexually explicit images in the media Westerners are willing to tolerate in the name of freedom. They perceive these issues as entailing human rights because rights are perceived as inhering in the collectivity rather than the individual. Religion. Some of the many religious differences can be understood in terms of the right/wrong mentality of the West, in contrast to the both/and orientation of the East. Eastern religions are characterized by tolerance and interpenetration of religious ideas. One can be a Confucian, a Buddhist, and a Christian in Korea and Japan. In China prior to the revolution, religious wars in the East have been relatively rare, whereas they have been endemic in the West for hundreds of years. Monotheism often carries with it the insistence that everyone accede to the same notion of God. It could be argued that Greeks should be held blameless in this, and perhaps this is true. It is the Abrahamic religions that have been so inclined toward religious warfare. On the other hand, it has been claimed that Christianity is the only religion that finds it necessary to have a theology specifying essential aspects of God, and that this insistence on categorization and abstraction is traceable to the Greeks. Cycles and recurrences are an integral part of many Eastern religions, but are less common in the West. Rebirth is part of some Eastern religions, but rare in Western ones. sin is understood to be a chronic condition and can be atoned for in many Eastern religions, as well as in Catholicism to a degree. But sin is hard to atone for or literally ineradicable in Protestant tradition. You might say that as one moves from west, from India, the number of possible states of death lowers drastically from the near infinity of reincarnations of Hinduism and Buddhism to the multiple levels of Catholic purgatory and circles of hell to the binary possibility of the Calvinist. Finally, it should be recalled that much of the evidence discussed in this book is drawn from everyday life problem solving. Japanese managers start at the bottom of their companies and are rotated among divisions frequently so as to maintain an overview of their company's activities. Building in China, even skyscrapers in Hong Kong, are built only after an exhaustive survey by Feng Shui experts who examine every conceivable ecological, topological, climatologic, and geometric feature of landscape, and proposed building simultaneously and in relation to one another. It is Westerners and Americans in particular who pioneered the atomistic, interchangeable, uniform, modular approach to manufacturing and merchandising. And so on. My claim is not that the cognitive differences we find in the laboratory causes the differences in attitudes, values, and behaviors, but that the cognitive differences are inseparable from the social motivational ones. People hold the beliefs they do because of the way they think and they think the way they do because of the nature of societies they live in. How should people think? Early in the 20th century, philosophers and psychologists effected a division of labor. Psychologists were given the descriptive task of finding out how people thought and behaved. Philosophers were assigned the prescriptive job of telling people how they ought to think and behave. Sometimes, though not as often as might have been advisable, philosophers have looked to the work of psychologists to find out what people actually do. But even if philosophers had been paying close attention to the work of psychologists, they would have found little to disabuse them of their convictions about universality. I believe the work reported here will have that effect on psychologists and consequently on philosophers as well, to see how philosophy might be affected by demonstrations of non-universality. Consider the riddle of induction, as introduced by David Hume in the 18th century. How are we justified, he asked, in assuming that the future will be like the past, that the food that nourished us today will nourish us tomorrow? There can be no question of a deductive solution to the problem. This food nourished me today, therefore it will nourish me tomorrow, has only a probabilistic status. It lacks the certainty that is required of a syllogism. And I end 1307 here. Most interesting book by Nisbett. Maybe we can show an example here in the end. Thanks. The Geography of Thought. Thank you. Bye bye for now.